Gianna Harris thought she was protecting the boardroom from a loiterer. She mocked his clothes, weaponized security, and performed a public execution of his dignity to impress her peers. She didn't check his credentials because she thought she knew his worth by his skin. What she didn't know was brutal. That loiterer controlled the $500 million lifeline her company desperately needed. By the time she learned his name, her career was already over. The story is just getting interesting. Subscribe to this channel now if you don't judge people by their appearances. George Freeman stepped out of the elevator and checked his watch. He was exactly 3 minutes early. As he walked toward the double doors of the executive suite, he wasn't looking for trouble. He was looking for the future of a $500 million investment. He wore a charcoal gray hoodie and dark jeans because he preferred to be judged by his balance sheet rather than his tailor. He was 10 steps from the conference room when Gianna Harris moved. She didn't just stand there. She stepped sideways, a deliberate physical interception that forced George to stop abruptly. She was dressed in a sharp, slate gray power suit, her hair pulled back in a tight, severe bun. She didn't ask if he was lost or if he needed help. She simply looked him up and down, her eyes lingering on his sneakers before she offered a thin, practiced smile. "You're not on the list," Gianna said. Her voice was pitched perfectly to carry across the hallway, where several other executives were already gathered. George didn't move. "I'm here for the 9 a.m., he replied, his voice level. Gianna didn't check the tablet in her hand. She didn't need to. She leaned back slightly, crossing her arms to match the physical barrier she had created with her body. "This meeting is for decision-makers," she added, her tone suggesting that even the suggestion of his presence was an absurdity. A few of the executives nearby slowed their conversations, their attention snagged by the confrontation. George could feel their eyes on him, but he kept his focus on Gianna. He didn't reach for his phone yet, and he didn't try to push past her. He simply stood his ground in the middle of the corridor, an island of casual clothing in a sea of expensive wool. "I understand the importance of the meeting," George said. "That's why I'm here." Gianna's smile didn't reach her eyes. It was a smirk of pure gatekeeping. She glanced over George's shoulder toward the security guard stationed near the elevators. "We can't have interruptions today," she said, speaking as if George were a piece of malfunctioning equipment rather than a person. "People like you don't just walk into rooms like that." The phrase hung in the air, heavy and pointed. It was the first clear humiliation, delivered with the confidence of someone who believed they held every card in the deck. George took a breath, noting the way the other executives shifted, some looking away in discomfort, while others watched with a hardened curiosity. He remained silent, letting the weight of her words fill the space between them. He was learning more about this company in 30 seconds of being blocked at the door than he had in 3 months of reviewing their financial audits. Gianna didn't move her feet, but she leaned forward, her presence meant to be an intimidation tactic. "Credentials," she demanded, snapping her fingers once before holding her palm out flat. George didn't flinch or reach for a wallet. He simply pulled his phone from his hoodie pocket and held it up at chest height. On the screen was a high-level digital access pass, the kind that usually bypassed 3 layers of security before a visitor even hit the elevator. Gianna didn't even tilt her head to look at the screen. Her eyes stayed locked on George's face, burning with a mix of impatience and condescension. "I said credentials," she repeated, her voice rising to ensure the executives lingering by the water station heard her clearly. "A digital image isn't a badge. I need to see a physical ID that says you belong on this floor." "The system is paperless," George said, keeping his voice low and steady. "This QR code contains the primary authorization for the 9 a.m. meeting. If you scan it, it will confirm everything." Gianna let out a sharp, brittle laugh that cut through the quiet of the hallway. She turned her head slightly toward a junior executive standing nearby, sharing the joke with an audience. "He thinks he can just show me a screen and walk into a $500 million negotiation," she said, her voice dripping with mock disbelief. She turned back to George, her face hardening instantly. "I don't have time to play games with interruptions. Your noise, and we are working on the survival of this company." The dismissal was total. She didn't just reject his ID. She rejected his presence as a relevant factor in the building. George took a slow breath, his phone still visible in his hand. He could see the junior assistant in the background looking down at a tablet, her brow furrowing as she tapped at the screen, but Gianna was too busy performing her role as the gatekeeper to notice. "Check the list again," George suggested. Gianna didn't budge. "I know who is supposed to be here," she snapped. "And it isn't someone who looks like they're headed to a gym. Now, put the phone away and move back toward the elevators before I make this a police matter." She didn't wait for a response before waving her hand dismissively, as if shooing a fly. The second humiliation was complete. He had been discarded without even the courtesy of a review. Gianna stepped closer, effectively crowding George's personal space until she was only inches away. She didn't look at his phone or his face. She looked through him. "This isn't the place to test boundaries," she said, her voice dropping into a low, jagged hiss that was nonetheless loud enough for the entire corridor to hear. "People like you don't just walk into rooms like that." The phrase hit the air like a physical weight. Behind her, a few of the executives shifted their feet, and a distinct murmur rippled through the audience of onlookers. It wasn't a murmur of protest. It was the sound of a group witnessing a public execution of dignity and deciding whether to look away or watch. One man in a navy suit actually nodded, his eyes fixed on George's hoodie as if the fabric itself was an affront to the corporate institution. George didn't flinch. He remained perfectly still, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. This silence seemed to infuriate Gianna more than an argument would have. She interpreted his composure as defiance. She turned her head toward the security guard, a man whose hand was already hovering near the holster on his belt. "We have a protocol for a reason," she announced to the room at large, her voice regaining its professional, performative edge. "We'll begin the session on time once this is handled and the hallway is cleared of distractions." A few people checked their watches. The pressure in the hallway was mounting. Gianna's eyes snapped back to George, flickering with a sense of triumph. "You've had your moment," she said. "Now move." Security took the cue. The guard stepped forward, his boots clicking sharply on the floor, and placed himself directly to George's right. The boundary had been drawn in the dirt, not just a professional one, but a social and systemic one. Gianna stood on the side of the door, and she had made it very clear that George was meant to stay on the side of the street. She savored the control, her chin tilted up as she waited for George to break. Instead, he just looked at her, memorizing the exact tone of her voice and the faces of the people who were currently nodding in agreement with his exclusion. Gianna turned her back to George, addressing the semicircle of executives like a conductor preparing an orchestra. "We won't be delayed any further by a problem," she announced, her voice projected with a forced professional calm that suggested George was a minor technical glitch she was personally resolving. She gestured broadly toward him, her hand cutting through the air as if she were clearing away clutter. "The integrity of this $500 million negotiation is our priority, and that starts with securing the room." A few phones remained lifted, the lenses catching the overhead lights as colleagues recorded the interaction. Gianna relished the attention, her posture straightening as she felt the eyes of her peers on her. She looked at the security guard and gave a sharp, definitive nod. "Handle this. We have real work to do inside." The guard, a man whose presence usually went unnoticed, now felt the weight of the audience. He stepped into George's immediate personal space, his hand reaching out to grab George's elbow. George didn't pull away, but he didn't assist either. He stood like a stone in a stream, forcing the guard to exert actual physical effort to move him. "Let's go, sir." "You're making this difficult," the guard muttered, his voice strained by the public nature of the task. Gianna watched with a smirk, her eyes tracking George's slow, forced retreat as if she were watching a victory lap. She didn't look at the junior assistant who was frantically trying to catch her eye, waving a tablet that was flashing a red priority alert. Gianna was too focused on the performance of her own authority. She wanted every person in that hallway to see exactly what happened when someone she deemed noise tried to cross the threshold into her world. "Remember this," she said to the room. her voice dripping with satisfaction as the guard's grip tightened on George's arm. "If the Capitol doesn't close today, it's because we wasted time on people who think rules don't apply to them." She reached for the heavy handle of the conference room door, ready to lead the important people inside and leave George in the corridor. George stood his ground, his boots anchored to the floor despite the security guards increasing pressure on his arm. He didn't struggle, but he didn't yield an inch. The hallway had gone completely silent, the kind of heavy, intentional quiet that usually precedes a disaster. Gianna stopped with her hand on the door handle and turned back, her face twisted into a mask of theatrical exasperation. She rolled her eyes so dramatically it was meant to be seen by the furthest executive in the corridor. "See," she said, gesturing toward George with a sharp, mocking flick of her wrist. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. Pure, unadulterated entitlement." She stepped away from the door and walked back toward him, her heels clicking like a countdown. "You think because you showed up and stood in a hallway, the world owes you a seat at the table," she said, her voice dripping with a casual cruelty that made a few of the junior staffers look at the floor. "You think the rules are for other people. You're holding up a $500 million transaction, money that keeps thousands of people employed, just to feed your ego." George still said nothing, his silence acting like a mirror that reflected Gianna's escalating hostility back at her. This lack of a reaction seemed to insult her more than a shouted argument would have. She turned her attention back to the semicircle of executives, seeking their validation. "He's a prime example of the problem," she continued, framing George as a personal attack on the company's success. "This is the me-first attitude that kills deals. If we lose the funding today because we're standing out here dealing with a squatter in a hoodie, I want everyone to remember this face. Remember that we were held hostage by a nobody's sense of self-importance." A few of the executives nodded, their faces hardening as they memorized the lie she was telling. They looked at George not as a person, but as an obstacle to their year-end bonuses. Gianna saw the support and leaned in closer to George, her voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "You're done here," she said, her eyes flashing with a sense of total victory. "Calling for backup won't help. No one's coming to save you from being a mistake." The junior assistant, a young woman named Sarah whose face had gone a ghostly shade of white, stepped forward with her tablet held out like a shield. She had been tapping frantically at the screen for the last 60 seconds, her eyes darting between the device and the man in the hoodie. "Gianna," she whispered, her voice cracking under the tension of the hallway. "There's an alert. You need to see this." Gianna didn't even turn her head. She was still locked in her confrontation with George, savoring the silent nods of approval from the senior executives. "Not now, Sarah," she snapped, her voice cutting through the assistant's hesitation like a blade. "We're handling a security breach. Stay in your lane." "But it's a primary authorization ping," Sarah persisted, her voice rising just enough to be heard by the people closest to her. She tried to thrust the tablet into Gianna's line of sight, the screen flashing a steady, rhythmic red. "The system just updated the participant list. The lead investor is." Gianna spun around, her face flushing with a mix of embarrassment and fury at being interrupted in front of her superiors. She shoved the tablet back toward the girl's chest, not even glancing at the data on the screen. "I said not now," she hissed, her eyes wide and threatening. "I don't care about a system glitch or a seating update. I am clearing this floor so we can save this company. If you can't handle the pressure of a high-stakes morning, maybe you should head down to HR and turn in your badge." Sarah flinched, her mouth snapping shut as she retreated a step. She looked at George, then back at the tablet, her hands trembling. She knew exactly what was on that screen, but the wall of Gianna's arrogance was too high to climb. Gianna turned back to George, a triumphant glint in her eyes now that she had silenced the only person trying to save her. "As I was saying," she said, smoothing the front of her slate gray suit, "you're done here." She gestured to the security guard, who tightened his grip on George's arm. The hallway went quiet again, a vacuum of sound waiting for the final removal. Gianna didn't realize that the red light on Sarah's tablet wasn't a glitch. It was the digital footprint of the man she was currently calling a nobody, and it was about to bring her entire world crashing down. The heavy boardroom door swung open with a sharp click, and the CEO, David Sterling, stepped into the hallway. He didn't look happy. He was checking his watch, his face tight with the stress of a man whose company was hours away from a liquidity crisis. "It's 9:05, David said, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "Why are we standing around out here? We are burning daylight on the most important." He stopped mid-sentence. His eyes traveled from the gathered executives to the security guard who still had a firm grip on George's arm. Then his gaze shifted to Gianna, who was standing there with a look of smug accomplishment. And finally, his eyes landed on the man in the charcoal hoodie. David froze. The color drained from his face so quickly it was as if someone had pulled a plug. He didn't move for 3 long seconds. The silence in the hallway became absolute. Even the executives who had been smirking a moment ago caught the shift in the atmosphere and lowered their phones. Gianna, completely misreading the CEO's shock, stepped forward with a flourish. "David, I'm so sorry for the delay," she said, her voice dripping with artificial regret. "We've had a bit of a security situation. This individual insisted on trying to force his way into the meeting without credentials. I was just having him removed so we could get started with the funding partner." David didn't look at her. He didn't even seem to hear her. He took 2 slow steps toward George, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. The security guard, sensing something was wrong, let go of George's arm and stepped back, his posture instantly shifting from aggressive to uncertain. "George," David whispered, his voice cracking. "George Freeman." Gianna blinked, her smile faltering for the first time. "David, no, this is just some guy who—" "Shut up, Gianna," David snapped, his voice a low growl of pure panic. He turned to George, his face a mask of desperation. "George, I am so sorry. There has been a massive misunderstanding. Please, tell me you just got here. Please tell me you haven't been standing out here for 10 minutes. George didn't move. He didn't accept the apology, and he didn't offer a smile. He just looked at David, then slowly turned his gaze to Gianna, who was now staring at George as if he had just transformed into a ghost right in front of her eyes. The power in the hallway didn't just shift. It evaporated from Gianna and pooled at George's feet. David's voice was barely a whisper, but in the dead silence of the hallway, it sounded like a gunshot. "This is George Freeman," the CEO said, his eyes scanning the faces of his staff with a look of pure terror. "He is the lead partner at Freeman Capital. He's not just on the list, Gianna. He is the list. Without his signature, this company doesn't exist by 5 o'clock today." Gianna's hand dropped from the door handle as if the metal had suddenly turned white hot. She looked at George's hoodie, then at his calm, steady eyes, and her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The executives who had been recording the entitlement of a stranger suddenly lowered their phones, their faces flushing with the realization that they had just documented their own professional suicide. George didn't wait for her to recover. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped the screen twice. "I came here to see if this firm was worth a $500 million lifeline," George said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made the security guard step back another 3 feet. "I wanted to see how you treat people when you think no one is watching. When you think there's no profit in being a decent human being." David stepped toward him, his hands held out in a silent plea. "George, please. Gianna is just—" She was overzealous. "We can go inside right now. We can finalize the term sheet." "The meeting is canceled," George said. He didn't look at the term sheet or the boardroom. He looked directly at Gianna, who was leaning against the wall, her breathing shallow. "In fact, the entire deal is frozen. I don't invest in companies that weaponize security against people based on the clothes they wear or the color of their skin. Your culture is toxic, David, and toxic assets aren't worth $500 million. "George, you can't be serious," David stammered. "We have payroll. We have vendors." "Then you should have hired better gatekeepers," George replied. He tapped his phone one last time. "I've just flagged this deal as pending conduct review in our system. That means the funds are locked. I suggest you spend the afternoon explaining to your board why a manager's need to perform authority was more important than the company's survival." He turned away from the CEO and looked at the crowd of executives. Every one of you who stood here and watched this happen, who filmed it and smirked while she called me a nobody, you are the reason I'm walking out that door. You didn't just fail a guest. You failed a character test. Gianna stood frozen as the weight of the silence shifted. The hallway, which had been her stage for a public execution of George's dignity, was now the site of her own professional erasure. She tried to speak, her voice trembling as she looked at the CEO. David, I was only following the security protocol you approved. I didn't know who he was. George didn't look at David. He looked directly at Gianna. That's the problem, he said, his voice flat and final. You only respect the person when you recognize the power. Real leadership is how you treat the people you think can do nothing for you. He turned his gaze to the security guard who had been holding his arm just minutes ago. The guard looked down, his face flushed with shame. Officer, George said, please escort Ms. Harris to the lobby. She no longer has access to this floor, and as of this moment, her digital credentials should be revoked. The guard hesitated for a fraction of a second, looking to the CEO. David merely nodded, a sharp, jerky motion of his head. He was too busy staring at the ruin of his company to argue. The guard stepped toward Gianna, the same hand that had grabbed George now gesturing for her to move. The fifth humiliation arrived, authority redirected in front of witnesses. Gianna's heels clicked unevenly on the floor as she was led away, her face a mask of shock. The executives who had filmed the encounter now looked at their phones as if they were holding evidence of a crime. Some tried to delete the videos. Others simply stared at the floor. George adjusted the hood of his sweatshirt and turned to the remaining group. I watched all of you, he said. Not one of you spoke up. Not one of you suggested that a human being deserved a basic level of professional courtesy regardless of what they were wearing. Your silence was instructive. It told me everything I need to know about the culture of this firm. David stepped forward, his voice desperate. George, let's just sit down. We can fix the culture. We can make changes today. You'll make changes because you're desperate, not because you've changed, George replied. He began walking back toward the elevators, his pace steady and unhurried. He stopped at the silver doors and looked back one last time. Access is earned by respect. You lost yours the moment you let a nobody be treated like a problem. The elevator doors closed on the silence of a boardroom that had just lost its future. George Freeman didn't need the $500 million, but the company certainly did. He walked out of the lobby and into the fresh air, leaving behind a group of people who finally understood that power doesn't always wear a suit, but character always leaves a mark. George's decision didn't just freeze a deal. It sent a shockwave through an entire industry. If this reversal made you pause, it's time to take action. Like this video if you believe respect is a non-negotiable requirement for leadership. Share it with someone who still mistakes authority for entitlement. Comment below the exact moment you felt the power shift, and tell us where you're watching from today. Finally, write one word that describes George's composure under pressure. Subscribe and turn on all notifications for more stories where humiliation backfires, dignity wins, and the underdog proves they were the one in charge all along. Your support helps us tell the stories that hold the gatekeepers accountable. See you in the next one.